again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Forensic investigators of Reddit. What are some of the most gruesome and horrific cases that you've worked on? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
EMT. It wasn't my call, but rather one of my coworkers. Get dispatched for vaginal bleeding. Arrive at the home to find a woman sitting in a pool of blood on her bedroom floor. Transport her to the hospital, where the doc examines her. He asks where the baby is. What? He states this woman just had a baby. So they go back to the home with police and search the place. My coworker looks under the bed and sees a bowling ball bag, opens the bag and finds the strangled dead baby. I witness a father of 2 children brutally murder his wife in the house when the children were upstairs. He then texted the mother's parents declaring, "I killed your daughter, call the police," before heading to the garage and hanging himself. I'm an expert in work-related incidents and am hired to investigate accidents and incidents for large corporations. 2 children fell down an elevator shaft on a building project. A powder centrifuge tore off the arm of a pharmaceutical industry employee. The coupling of a compressed air hose broke and fatally struck a retired person. I handled a case that involved 2 young sisters, ages 8 and 4, actually 13 and 6 at the time. This was 20 years ago, along with their meth-head mother and her boyfriend. Persuaded that her daughters were under the influence of demons, the mother made them take bleach baths. When that didn't work, she started making them drink bleach. The older girl knew enough to immediately throw up the bleach, and she would drag her sister behind the couches or wherever they could in the house to throw it up. Eventually, the little daughter couldn't throw it up anymore and died. She then froze the little sister and proceeded to hack the frozen baby into pieces in front of the older sister and then disposed of the pieces somehow. They sent us inside to search for the body. Walking into that house, the smell of bleach was overwhelming, and I can still remember all the bleach stains on the carpet. Back in my forensic anthropology student days, we worked on an unknown, unclaimed skeleton for class. We'd analyze these skeletons for class as part of our weekly projects. According to the story, Jane Doe, who was never in town, quickly made some acquaintances at a local bar. Jane Doe and her 3 new friends get the bright idea to go rob the local motorcycle gang. The gang has a house in town, but they're not there right now. Only a couple of their old ladies are present at the house. So, these 4 brain surgeons come up with a plan. Jane Doe and another woman will go up to the door in a panic. They'll bang on the door and scream for help. Once the door opens, the 2 guys would emerge from the bushes. Then they could rob the house. So with a plan in hand, they get to the house. Jane Doe and the lady run up and start banging on the door. They're screaming loudly, terrified that someone is pursuing them. Inside are 2 of the gang's girlfriend wives. They figure something's up. One gets a shotgun, one gets on the phone and dials 911. The women outside are banging so hard on the door, it begins to break and to come apart. The lady with the shotgun is scared and has it pointed at the door. The door breaks open, and Jane Doe is the first through it. The shotgun lady unleashes both barrels, erasing Jane Doe's face from eyebrows to chin. This was back in the 90s. I wonder if they ever figured out who she was. A model house for a new subdivision was busy with 4 people, 3 women and 1 man running sales. The model house was the first on the street, adorned with signs proclaiming "come on in" and encouraging people to tour it before potentially signing up to build a house in the subdivision. A well-known local drifter had been watching the house for days, ended up taking all 4 hostages. He SA'd several of the women and fatally injured them, all with blunt force trauma. He had entered with an old gun, but that didn't stop him from making things awful for these people's deaths. A SWAT team ultimately took down the man after a solid day of standoff. The case was kind of high profile, so they moved the trial 3 hours away. I had seen lots of terrible things in my time at the DA's office, but this crime was particularly brutal and upsetting. Apparently, he had been watching the model house because of one woman in particular he was basically stalking. He had been regarded as a harmless man, usually just looking for some change around town, but the cruelty and brutality he exhibited that day were haunting. He had a paranoid schizophrenic male who forced his elderly mother to eat rocks, and I mean a shitload of rocks, to the point where she died. He told police that he was feeding her rocks to weigh her down so God couldn't take her yet. I did a case once where the home had burnt down. As was always the case, the homeowner was asked to provide a list of everything in the home. Tip: make this list before your house burns down. Most people, not this guy, can't remember, and this is how insurers shortchange you. But I digress. So the homeowner emails me a list, all 190 pages of size 12 aerial print, single-spaced. The first 48 pages were all the books in the house, every single book, and I mean all of them. Over 3,200 in total were biographies, memoirs, and other books related to serial killers. And then, as if to prove the adage, it's the ones you least suspect, he was a typical middle-aged man with a wife and 2 children. 2 months after the house's demolition and the discovery of 6 bodies in the crawlspace beneath it, police arrested him. I am employed as a Children's Protective Services worker here. We do forensic interviewing during our investigation, so I'm counting myself in. I watched the autopsy of a 2-month-old infant with suspected COD of asphyxiation from regurgitating too much milk from being overfed. As they peeled back the infant's scalp, they revealed a massive skull fracture and brain bleed from sharp, blunt force trauma, turning the autopsy into a homicide. I was working a case of what was thought to be an B&E, and the homeowner killed them in self-defense. The person killed was a 16-year-old boy. The case was about to be shut, but the lead said to have the body examined for other trauma. They found semen in the boy's rectum, and a few days later, a neighbor sent in a video from a Ring doorbell showing the man dragging a body. The boy had been AR'd and then killed, then dragged into his house to make it look like he was acting in self-defense. His brother then committed suicide about 2 weeks later. They had to take the mother to a mental institution due to her suicidal tendencies. As a forensic student, I helped piece together the ripped-up diaries of a girlfriend who was supposedly killed by her boyfriend and shoved into a freezer. There was another woman in there too, one of the big freezers with the lift-up lid. The police discovered evidence that the freezer had been turned off a few times due to the boyfriend running out of electricity. Hubby and I were both volunteer EMTs. My worst call was a couple who were on their way to celebrate their first anniversary. There was a bad storm, and they hydroplaned under a semi whose back wheels ran up over the passenger side of the car. The impact instantly killed the wife. The woman fell into her husband's lap. My ambulance transported the husband, who only had a broken arm. We weren't allowed to tell passengers if someone died, so I had to spend the whole trip to the hospital reassuring him that the other ambulance would do everything and its very best for her, knowing she was DOA. He was talking about how it was their first anniversary and that she was 3 months pregnant. I totally checked out after that call and only lasted another month or so. I was still in the ED doing paperwork when he got the news, and the wail of grief still haunts me.
I mean, it goes without saying how difficult a job is being a first responder and having to maintain professionalism when knowing a fact. It's truly heartbreaking. So thank you to everyone who works in that field, and I'm sorry that you have to go through that.
I was a med student doing a trauma rotation in New York City. Guy comes into the ER super torn up, escorted by more than a few police officers and handcuffed to the gurney. In summary, he struggled with mental instability and resided with his parents. He snapped that morning, stabbed both of them a bunch of times, then jumped in front of a subway train and got rolled up underneath it. He survived and remained conscious and even conversational, as we literally cleaned tar off his skull, not head, skull, like hold flaps of skin back and pull sticky tar and dirt from the bone. He couldn't see anything because his face was so badly injured. What stands with me forever were the conversations. He clearly was not living in the same reality as the rest of us. He talked a lot about comic books and TV shows. At one point, he asked us if this was going to take long. We all kind of look at each other like, what is this guy talking about? The cop finally answers, I'm not sure you're going anywhere anytime soon. The patient replies, well, can someone call my mom then and ask her to feed my birds? Like, dude, you murdered your mom less than an hour ago. I used to work in the field. Craziest was a chap who tied a steel cable to a tree, then through his car window, secured it around his neck, then floored the car. Cable ran out of slack and, well, pop. It always amazed me how clean it came right off. Decapitations are normally pretty messy, but this guy's creativity led to a fairly clean, instant, and memorable death for those who worked his case. Oh, and also consider a toxic megacolon. Conduct a Google image search for it, but avoid doing so during dinner. Just imagine dying of a 20-kilogram turd stuck in your gut. It was like delivering the world's worst baby when we pulled it out during the PM. I'm still fresh in the field and don't have any super horrific stories, but I interned with the police department while working toward my master's. I went to a scene with a deceased adult male. The death was suspected to have been caused by an overdose, and according to my memory, he'd been dead for approximately 8 hours. Nothing gruesome, but his parents found him. They were crying in the next room as an officer spoke with them. In the deceased's bedroom, which he shared with his toddler, I remember seeing all the toys on the floor and how they were like my cousins. I started getting a bit emotional, but then found bags of powder hidden in the child's clothing drawer. A medical examiner taught a meteorological investigation course at the university. The course included numerous case photos, but the one that sticks in my memory is of a suicide bomber. The explosives he had wrapped around himself exploded downward. His top half appeared completely untouched, while everything below the waist had either disappeared or was in a tangled mess. I also did a mock reconstruction report for the 1970 MacDonald murders. I had access to scene and autopsy photos, including those of children. These were almost 50-year-old pictures, so the quality was not the greatest, but I don't think I'll forget them for a long time. Okay, this dates back many years to my time as a U.S. Army CID criminal investigator. I was working a fraud case against a soldier, whom I'll call Sturgis, who had been collecting housing allowance but actually living in his car. Total was about $11,000. So it was not like he was looking at prison time or anything. The worst case scenario was a dishonorable discharge. But his company XO made a hobby out of making this guy's life miserable while the investigation was going on. He personally escorted the guy to all his meetings with me, the JAG office, and other than that, he was basically on full lockdown. One day they had an extended field exercise, still on base, but sleeping in tents for a few days and doing, infantry stuff. When they got back to the company grounds, everyone lined up at the arms room to turn in their M16s and other various weaponry, but Sturgis instead walked out into the middle of the parade ground and sat down. The XO came out after him, yelling all the way about what a world of shit he was going to rain down on him. Sturgis stood up and shot him full auto with ammo he'd pocketed from the range, stitched him from groin to neck. Then Sturgis sat back down and put the muzzle to his eye socket and held the trigger down for as long as he could. Once the duty agent who got the call put together who the cast of characters was, he called me since I had the existing case file. When I got there, the XO's body was gone. They had taken him to the ER, but DOA. They didn't bother with Sturgis because his head appeared to be deflated like a basketball. It turned out that the bullet from his rifle went right through his brain and shattered the top of his skull, and the muzzle gas pushed his brain completely out of it. One perfect hemisphere lay next to him, while the other, surprisingly far away, had landed in an anthill and was crawling with ants. I used a tongue depressor to roll the loose parts of Sturgis into a plastic bag. His autopsy was the next day, and I attended to take photographs for the file, not a personal thing. That was almost 30 years ago, and can still hear the medical examiner say, "Ugh, there's ants all over this thing." Like, sorry dude, was the thing that made this job too real for you? Long story short, arson case. 2 kids die. The owners kicked out the lady who started the fire from the house for an unknown reason. She had a previous felony arson charge. They found her a few days later living with her boyfriend in a tent with multiple gas cans. They arrested her, released her, and dropped all charges. That's when I realized, 1, how flawed our judicial system truly is, and 2, that I no longer wanted to investigate homicides. I was on the scene of a crash where a drunk mother went off the highway into the central median, which was basically a ditch. She collided with a bridge's support column, ejecting her 2 daughters, aged 6 and 8. The 6-year-old was dead on the scene, and the 8-year-old died in the helicopter on the way to the hospital. Mom lived, of course. The impact was so hard that I was standing about 300 yards away with the car's battery at my feet. When Dad found out, he attempted to attack Mom in the hospital. Unfortunately, police were there to clear her to go to jail and stop the dad. The client committed suicide by connecting zip ties around their neck and pulling. Frantic scratch marks indicated they regretted the action but could not cut the zip ties due to sharp restrictions. The Sharps restriction was enforced due to recent morbid self-mutilation. The sight of claw marks on the neck and the absence of oxygen in the brain was the most heartbreaking thing I've ever witnessed. The inability to say the individual died on their own terms is often the only bright side to any type of suicide I deal with. I'm a rookie police officer. It was my first full year on the streets. The morning roll call had just broken. I got into my patrol car and started getting ready for the day when a call for a person with a weapon came over the radio. This is a fairly common call in my area of patrol, so you never really know what you're going to get. So I get to the address that the radio gave me and get out of my car and start going toward the property where the call came from when another patrol car shows up, then meets me at the door, but it's locked. As we begin to knock loudly, we hear a young woman crying and screaming. Eventually, she opens the door and yells, "Upstairs, 3rd floor." The young woman gestures toward the stairs. Since we don't know if it's a gun, a knife, a bat, or anything else, we draw our firearms and begin climbing the stairs. I was the first inside the 3rd floor, and all the lights were out, and it was still dark outside. So I drew my flashlight and started making my way around bends and turns of that floor when I saw some lady sitting on the couch, and I said, "Ma'am, where is he at?" As I cross in front of her with my flashlight and clear the rest of the room, the cop behind me puts his light on the lady and sees she has a 12-inch knife in the center of her chest. Turns out, the woman was smoking PCP the night before and stabbed herself in the chest. What's weird about it is that she was sitting upright with her eyes open and her head straight. Then we looked at the floor and it was covered in blood. So after stabbing herself square in the chest, she walked around a little bit before sitting down on the couch and passing away. Stay away from drugs. I work in forensic pathology. I'm usually just on the surgical side. However, I live in an extremely rural area, so I regularly alternate between surgical and forensic. I actually love it. One case that absolutely crushes my spirit involved one of my high school classmates. I saw the result of child abuse on an 11-month-old with stages of healing dating back months.
The child's skull looked like pop rocks on the scan. Her husband faced prosecution, but she remains free. Her son survived. Somehow, I thought when I was asked to just look that they were absolutely gone. She lost custody of all of her children. I can't for the life of me understand how she gets to walk around and post pictures of her children on Facebook when there's no way she could have been ignorant to the situation. Every case I see with a child hits hard, but this one has stuck with me on a personal and emotional level. So after 2 years of trying, my fiancée finally got a job at the police station under records, and she has already dealt with a lot of About 2 weeks into the job, an 11-year-old committed suicide. Her mom was apparently outside crying and saying he was just a joyful kid, but neighbors said otherwise, saying he was obviously depressed. Apparently, the mom had a drug problem and would tease this kid about spending time with him. If he did anything she didn't like, she would leave him there for hours on end alone, letting him think he's a cup. The kid was literally starved of having no affection or quality time with the parent. He hung himself in his room. On the other end, I had a class in AIT with a former infantryman. While sitting at the table with 3 other guys on their laptops, one stood up and shouted and left without closing his laptop. A few minutes later, they heard a burst of gunfire come from outside. My buddy had some criminal investigators come up to him, asking him what was on the laptop. Turns out his wife emailed him, saying she had been cheating on him. She was taking the house and kids, all of it. He left the room and went up to one of the guard towers. I told the soldier that the CO wanted to see him and that he would be holding his spot until they got back. Took his rifle, put it on burst, and blew his head open like a cauliflower. They had to repaint the whole guard tower black to hide the bloodstain. He said he hated him for doing it because the black box was hotter inside than it was outside. I worked as a Child Protective Services investigator, already commented once, but here's another. The case I dealt with was likely the most severe instance of SA I ever encountered. The case involved the father of twin girls. They were 9 when our investigation started. The mother of the girls had low cognitive abilities and almost zero protective capacity. Shortly after the girls' birth, she and the father separated. Starting around age 6, likely earlier, but our forensic interviews uncovered back to that age, the father began continuous SA on both girls. He would tie them up and repeatedly R them, often involving other adult partners. He forced the girls to perform SA on each other while he watched or joined in. The saddest part was watching the girls' behaviors after we removed them from the father's custody. The girls could not be allowed to see each other because it would trigger them to go into a state of panic or trigger older S responses and inappropriate behavior. This was particularly sad because both girls desperately wanted contact with each other, but teams of therapists recommended against this and were working to pursue interaction again when I left the case. Both girls were suicidal and attempted to kill themselves on multiple occasions, including eating broken glass, running into traffic, etc. The girls would also act out when triggered by running away. One incident, one of the twins was found huddled naked in a ditch after being gone for 2 days. In another incident, an older male R'd the other girl and she ran away for several days. Multiple convictions led to the father's sentence of 25 years, which in my opinion is far too short. I don't work in forensics, but still have a relatable story. I was employed on the 3rd shift at a renowned truck stop gas station. For a few days, we had complaints that one of only 3 stalls in the men's bathroom was always occupied, but didn't think anything of it because we're a busy location. One night, a Hispanic guy ran up to me and a coworker, shouting in broken English, "Bathroom, bathroom." My buddy just shrugged it off, thinking they needed more hand towels or something, and told him he'd get there in just a few minutes. But the Hispanic guy seemed really frantic and grabbed his arm, saying, "No, bathroom, come." It turned out that a large trucker had pushed himself into the smaller stall to relieve himself, suffered a severe heart attack, and passed away immediately.
The Hispanic man panicked when he noticed two huge limp feet hanging from under the stall and came to us for help. It took paramedics and fire crews approximately 3 hours to extricate the 400-pound-plus man from the stall, as his size prevented them from opening the inward swinging door hold enough. They ended up having my coworker help them disassemble the entire thing so they could try and lift him out. He had been in there for almost 3 days at that point, so the body was blotchy and bloated. It was not the weirdest night I ever had on the job, unfortunately, but definitely the only one involving a dead guy, lol. I'm a volunteer firefighter from Germany, and a guy from a partner fire station about 4 cities away from where I live told me that they once had a body that was approximately 2 weeks dead. First of all, there were flies all over the place and larvae in his whole body. Second, the police and fire service were only called because of the smell, apparently no family or friends. Third, the guy melted to the armchair he died in, so they had to cut around him to let the forensics team examine him. Then, they just took him in whole chair to the court medic to determine the cause of his death. The cause of his death was cardiac arrest, and he was morbidly obese, lived solely on fast food, and appeared to rarely leave his apartment. This post is not forensic related, so I apologize, but after reading some of the others, I thought this suited the post's vibe. My friend was a police traffic officer, and this horrible story stuck with me. Went to a serious car crash to find a young couple in their 20s that had been T-boned at high speed by some drunk driver who cut a junction. No injuries occurred during the drunk driver's conviction and imprisonment. The male driver was killed instantly, but the female passenger suffered no serious physical harm. Unfortunately, she was stuck in the car for an hour or so, with her now dead boyfriend's brains covered all over her head and body. I can't imagine what she went through. My friend told me how he crouched down and held that poor girl's hand while they were waiting for the people to arrive to cut her out. She was obviously incredibly distraught, shrieking with terror, etc. My mate worked locally in that area for a while, and my mate became a support person for this girl, ironically. They bonded through the accident, and the girl looked up to my mate for how he tried to help her. She struggled emotionally after the accident, and my friend genuinely cared for her, going out of his way a few times to ensure her well-being. My friend later got PTSD from seeing too many of these situations and was never the same since. Got called in to do a post-blast at a government compound. Additional hazards delayed the start of the recovery operations. One part of the building had completely collapsed, and as I climbed up the rubble pile to take some measurements for my report, my leg became trapped. Turns out, someone had been there during the initial explosion, so I was now knee-deep in someone's chest cavity. Continuing to work the site, I had to go through a narrow hallway with a coroner working on a body that had been shot and hit with a few RPG-7s, so it's a pile of goo mostly. I grabbed his shoulder to let him know I was passing, but he was startled and ended up tripping me into the mush pile. By the end of the day, I looked like someone in Evil Dead. I worked in forensics units, essentially where they send the criminally insane. I didn't see any bodies, but worked with the people that created them. One person was getting a divorce, one parent was using the other's mental health depression, but well managed and worked full-time to gain full custody, and they could afford the better lawyer. They drowned all 4 of their kids at bath time in a psychotic break. One person waited until their parents were asleep, went to the shed, got an axe, and started with their father, then their mother. They killed Grandma last, then told the police they did it so they could be with Jesus. They really thought it was what they would have wanted.
One person was in prison for something unrelated, and one day during checks, they were found to be holding what looked like an organ. They used a blunt prison knife to stab their cellmate, leaving a deep cut that revealed the liver. It took a considerable amount of time for anyone to muster the courage to remove the organ from their hands. They said they wanted to know if it tasted different from the liver served that day, and thought their cellmate wouldn't mind. One person had only one eye, but his other one was gouged out while they slit the throat of a random stranger on the street. This action was promoted by voices. One person was in prison for murdering 2 people. One day they decided to introduce someone's head to the floor multiple times. They said prison was very boring for them, and they missed hurting people. Just a bunch. But I'm guessing the 2 murders they were charged with weren't their first. They had a very impressive list of diagnoses, including BPD, MPD, and ASPD. We had plenty of people who did some really depraved things, or torture and hostage taking. I definitely wish I hadn't read some of the index offenses, but often it was necessary to know exactly what to avoid doing or saying to whom.